What if I told you that a country once richer than most of Europe, bursting with the largest oil reserves on Earth, collapsed so completely that millions of its own people walked out of the nation on foot? What if I told you that the answer isn't just economics, ideology, or incompetence, but the secret mechanics of power itself? Imagine a land where gasoline was cheaper than water, where presidents promised eternal prosperity, and where one resource, black gold, justified every political gamble. A nation that should have been untouchable became a ghost of itself. By the end of this story, you'll see how decisions in boardrooms, political halls, and secret deals across continents dictated the fate of tens of millions of lives. You'll hear about powerful economies that quietly profited, about hidden contracts and shadow markets, and about a global game where oil was both the sword and the poison. This isn't just the story of a nation that failed, it is the story of how resources, politics, and international leverage can reshape the destiny of a people. So ask yourself, did Venezuela collapse because of internal decay, or because the real architects of global power wanted it that way? Tonight, we pull back the curtain. In the early 20th century, Venezuela was a quiet, agrarian nation of tropical mountains and Caribbean breezes, until one resource changed everything: oil. By the 1920s, global companies like Royal Dutch Shell and Standard Oil had carved up Venezuelan oil concessions. By mid-century, Venezuela was supplying an insatiable world hungry for energy. By the 1940s, a 50-over-50 rule rewrote the terms of global oil extraction, giving greater profit shares to the state and laying the foundation for future national power. Then, in 1975, the Venezuelan government nationalized its oil fields under a single company, Petróleos de Venezuela, S.A. PDVSA, a corporate colossus that should have been a source of infinite wealth. For decades, oil was the backbone of a nation's identity, a seemingly unshakable economic engine, powering schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. In the early 2000s, Venezuela was exporting millions of barrels per day, commanding influence across global markets. Then something changed. Under President Hugo Chavez, who rose to prominence in the late 1990s, Venezuela went through a revolution, a political sea change built on radical social programs and anti-establishment rhetoric. Chavez championed a vision of resource nationalism, seizing private assets and reshaping the economy towards state control. Critics called it populism, supporters called it justice. But nationalizing oil and centralizing control came with a price. Skilled managers were replaced with loyalists. Expertise was drained from PDVSA. An economy that once hummed with global trade was now tightly wound around a single, fragile axis: oil revenue. This was not just economics. This was a hidden order. A nation's dependence on oil became a vulnerability, a lever that global powers could exploit. The secret lies here. Oil was never merely a commodity for Venezuela. It was the currency of power, globally and domestically. To understand the collapse, we must first see oil for what it really was. Not a national treasure stored beneath desert sands. Not a symbol of prosperity, but a strategic asset, and one that the world's real power players, governments, trading conglomerates, financial manipulators were more than willing to use. For decades, PDVSA was the engine of the Venezuelan state. Its production funded every public program. Its profits paid for housing, healthcare, and education. It was the beating heart of an ambitious, if arrogant, national project. But when oil descended from more than $100 per barrel in 2014 to under $30 in 2016, an economic spiral was set in motion. Revenues cratered. The government, addicted to high oil income, was forced to borrow, print money, and squeeze every remaining drop of oil revenue to balance its books. Then came the crucial twist. Sanctions first targeted financial sanctions, then sweeping oil industry sanctions. In 2019, The United States led a campaign to isolate Venezuela's economy, freezing assets and cutting off access to global financial markets. These sanctions weren't just symbolic. They effectively detached Venezuela from the legal oil market, forcing PDVSA into shadow markets and off-books deals to sell its crude. Without access to international buyers or financing, PDVSA's production plummeted. Huge tankers, loaded with crude, were forced into clandestine shipments, undercutting prices, paying steep markups to intermediaries willing to take the risk. And here's the key. Those intermediaries were the real winners. Powerful trading firms, hidden brokers, and geopolitically connected companies that profited wildly from Venezuela's desperation. These firms scooped Venezuelan crude at steep discounts, shipped it to market, and reaped cash profits unnoticed by the world. What was once a national treasure was now a liquid asset traded in the shadows, generating profit not for Venezuelans, but for those positioned to take advantage of instability. That's the first major plot twist. The collapse was no accident. It was engineered, magnified, and exploited by external forces that knew exactly what they were doing. But the story doesn't end there, not by a long shot. To understand the total collapse, we don't simply ask what happened, we track the evidence. Oil production decline. Once producing above 2.5 million barrels per day, Venezuela's oil output fell to crisis levels, under 350,000 barrels per day by 2020. A structural failure or a controlled implosion? The numbers tell us a collapse of investment, sanctions, and mismanagement, but also a clear pattern. The tighter the squeeze, the deeper the drop. This wasn't just technical failure, it was political leverage. When a country's main source of revenue is cut off from the global economy, citizens don't endure this quietly. They emigrate. Businesses shut down. Hyperinflation becomes the norm. Currency and banking breakdown. The Venezuelan government lost control of its own currency. With the central bank printing money to cover deficits, inflation spiraled into hyperinflation that shattered savings and destroyed purchasing power. The economy wasn't just failing, it was imploding from the inside out. Hidden deals and offshore winners. While the Venezuelan state struggled, a different narrative unfolded in private corridors of power. Trading firms with access to sanctioned oil made massive gains by buying crude at deep discounts. From Caribbean terminals to European refineries, Venezuelan oil changed hands illegally and lucratively. In the shadows of sanction enforcement, there were loopholes, intermediaries willing to pay top dollar for discounted oil. Some companies bought Venezuelan crude with U.S. government approval under new, limited export licenses, using sophisticated tactics to turn crisis into cash. This wasn't a mistake. It was exploitation. The fall of institutions. PDVSA, once a proud pillar of the Venezuelan economy, became hollowed out by corruption, political appointments, and loss of talent. Managers were replaced with loyalists. Expertise was replaced with ideology. Decisions were driven less by economics than by political loyalty. When institutions decay, markets follow. But the hidden twist is that outside interests were already setting terms for their own gain long before domestic institutions finally broke. Migration and social collapse. The human toll was devastating, one of the largest mass migrations in modern history. Millions of Venezuelans fled poverty, shortages, and insecurity. But every migrant, every shuttered factory, and every empty school desk was also a transfer of human capital out of the nation and into neighboring economies. And while Venezuelans suffered, shadow profits stacked up elsewhere. Here is the real secret. The collapse of Venezuela didn't just happen, it was shaped by forces that were ready to profit from every twist of the crisis. Oil sanctions didn't just punish Venezuela, they created a parallel oil market where discounts became standard, intermediaries became kingmakers, and shadow profits replaced stable national revenue. Global trading firms like Vitol and others were granted licenses to trade Venezuelan oil, moving product through complex networks that obscured origin and maximized margin. Meanwhile, sovereign debt markets saw Venezuela's bonds collapse in value not by accident, but because investors anticipated default. Hedge funds shorted Venezuelan debt. Speculators bought in cheap. Distressed assets changed hands for fractions of their face value, creating private winners out of public loss. And in boardrooms in Houston, London, and Singapore, executives watched these shifts not as tragedies, but as risk opportunities, ways to arbitrage instability, maximize returns, and deepen their strategic position in global energy markets. No wonder some companies made billions while a nation's GDP shrank by over 3/4. The great revelation is this: global power doesn't operate through newspapers and elections, it operates through capital flows, leverage, and information asymmetry. This is the hidden architecture of collapse. Deception wrapped in economic policy, crisis wrapped in geopolitical strategy. So does this power still exist today? Absolutely. In 2026, after decades of manipulation, the political landscape has shifted dramatically. President Nicolás Maduro, the most controversial leader of the Bolivarian era, was captured in early January. The oil markets reacted instantly. Discounted Venezuelan crude now enters new contractual frameworks. American refineries and trading houses get access through unprecedented export licenses. What does this mean? A new geopolitical oil game is emerging where former pariahs become strategic assets again. But make no mistake, the winners aren't always governments. They're investment funds, conglomerates, private equity firms, and think tanks that position themselves to capitalize on instability. Invisible power today looks like investment vehicles positioning for recovery in Venezuelan energy sector, conglomerates securing discounted oil supply contracts, geopolitical lobbies advocating for relaxed sanctions, digital networks shaping public perception around economic policy. This is not theory, it's reality. Every contract, every tanker route, every financial instrument now tied to Venezuelan oil creates profit opportunities outside Venezuela itself. Wars are fought not just with weapons, but with currencies, tariffs, sanctions, and pipelines. So here's the final unsettling thought. A nation with more oil than Saudi Arabia, more natural wealth than most of Europe, now survives on the edge of recovery, not because its people failed, but because powerful networks wielded its resource like a commodity of geopolitical leverage. And the question we must ask ourselves is not just, who failed Venezuela, but who profited from it, and what does that say about the world we live in? When an economy collapses, who writes the story? When millions flee, who counts the cost? When oil flows through dark waters, who gets paid? The truth is never simple, but it's everywhere, in the oil tankers, in the balance sheets of shadow firms, in the sanctions imposed and lifted, in the fortunes made while families starved. This story doesn't end here. In fact, it begins a new chapter, one where resource power, geopolitical strategy, and economic domination intersect in ways most of us never see.